Right, thanks very much for coming, everyone. My name's Andy. I am probably one of the last things standing in between all of you and some drinks, so I'll try and keep this on track and on target. Let me just get this on. Right, cool. My presentation is called Breaking the Kill Chain. It's all about some of the common flaws that we've seen in organizations when we've been responding to cybersecurity incidents, and what those organizations could have done to stop these attacks from happening, basically. So although I work in incident response and we absolutely love responding to incidents all the time, we would much prefer our customers just not to have any incidents. So that's what the presentation is all about. It's all about recommendations on how to stop attacks from happening. So during the course of the presentation, we're going to look at 3 incidents that we've responded to, 3 different types. So we're going to look at a phishing incident, first of all. This is sort of easy end. Then we're going to move to a vulnerable external service. So we're going to look at some things that organizations tend to have sitting on the perimeter of the network, facing the internet, and how attackers can leverage those and how we can protect them. And then we're going to move on to the difficult side over here, compromised supplier, and what we can do about that. So we're going to start off with the phishing incident, first of all. So in terms of phishing attacks, we split phishing attacks into 2 main categories. The first one is credential theft. This is where an attacker is trying to get credentials from users by making up sort of fake websites like this. And they'll get usernames, passwords, and they can also get MFA codes through these methods as well. So it's a good way for an attacker to get into a network, onto a system in some way by getting valid creds. The other type of phishing attack that we come across quite frequently are the malicious payloads. So this is where an email is delivered into the organization, and it might have something like a malicious Word document attached to it, like this, or it could have a link inside that email that takes the user to a download site where another payload is downloaded onto their machine. So for our phishing attack, here's our attacker sitting at the top. So what happened in this case was the attacker delivered a phishing email into the organization. That phishing email had a link inside of it to an attacker-controlled website. User obviously goes ahead and clicks on that link, because that's what users do. When the user clicks on that link, that triggers a download of a malicious Excel file. John mentioned earlier that Excel macros are kind of out of favor, so this could be something else. It could be a OneNote file, it could be an HTA file, it could be a shortcut file, anything like that. Some other malicious file, basically. In this example, the user then enabled macros, because that is what users do. They like to press yes to everything and bypass all the security controls. When this happened, Excel connects out to the internet and downloads a small remote access Trojan called STBbot, and that is now running on the machine as that user. The remote access Trojan then connects out to a command and control server on the internet using HTTPS. And at that point, the attacker has remote access into that system and can do anything on there that the user has access to do, basically. So if we break down each stage of this attack, what can we do to sort of stop each stage? So when we're looking at the recommendations, we're looking at sort of how to break this chain. So a good way to break a chain is with some bolt cutters. So I've categorized these into sort of 3 different areas. So 1 bolt cutter is easy to implement, all the way through to 3, which is sort of pretty tricky to do. And this will just give you a bit of an indication as to how easy these controls would be to implement in your organization or in your customers' organizations. So if we look at the first part of the attack, so we've got this malicious email coming in. So ideally, we don't want that email to get to the user. We don't want them to get that delivered into their mailbox, basically. Most organizations have got some kind of email filtering in place, but it could be that it hasn't been configured to the correct level to stop sort of malicious emails coming in. It might be more focused on looking at sort of spam coming into the organization and stopping that spam. So if we can look at our email filtering and just make sure that's configured correctly to block malicious emails and maybe do some testing on it as well. Second element, so we've got this malicious file of some sort. In this case, it was an Excel file, but it could be anything. Being downloaded from a bit of a dodgy-looking website. So again, web filtering here can be used to look at downloads from unknown websites. So a lot of organizations are looking at, they might want to stop sort of adult websites or gambling websites being accessed, but they might not have controls over unknown or uncategorized websites. So strengthening the web filtering in place is a really good recommendation here. It's another quite easy thing to do. For this example for Excel, so Microsoft have already gone ahead and done this. So the blocking of macro execution, as long as you're running an up-to-date version of Microsoft Office, macro execution is blocked for files originating from the internet. Unfortunately, there's still ways around this because the users can remove the kind of mark of the web. And sometimes we've seen malicious Excel files or Word documents that have instructions in them of how to do that. So they're kind of guiding the user through sort of how to remove that security control. And then the third part of the attack is where we've got this remote access Trojan on the machines. Sorry, this is the download of the remote access Trojan by Office. So for Office to be able to download that remote access Trojan, it requires connectivity to the internet. So most of the time, you probably don't want Word connecting out to the internet. So you can use the Windows firewall built into the operating system. You can configure that to prevent the Office applications from connecting out to the internet. A little bit tricky to do. Probably need to do a bit of testing around that just to make sure you're not breaking anything. And then the second control here is around Defender application control. This is another feature that's built into Windows 10 and above, and it allows you to add applications onto an allow list. A bit tricky to configure and to maintain as well. There's a bit of manual effort involved in that, so I've given that, that sort of 3 out of 3 in terms of the difficulty. But it's a really good control in terms of blocking unknown executables from running on your machines. And then the final bit, we've got the command and control channel going out from this remote access Trojan. So again, we could use web filtering to block those connections as well. A lot of the time we see attackers connecting out. They're not even using a domain name. They're just using an IP address to connect out. So blocking direct IP connections is quite a good recommendation as well to stop that command and control traffic from getting out. Right, moving on to the second incident. This is a vulnerable external service. There's a few different ways in which an external service could be vulnerable. So we've got sort of zero days being discovered in these products all the time. When 0 days are discovered and they're patched by the vendor, it's quite important for organizations to get those patches installed really, really quickly. These security products are all things that tend to sit on the perimeter of networks and are meant to be exposed to the internet. So the fact that they've had sort of critical vulnerabilities in them is not ideal. But when those vulnerabilities are announced by the vendor, it's really important to patch these quickly. We tend to see that organizations have really good control over Windows patching, but when it comes to devices such as this, there tends to be a bit more of a lag in terms of getting those patches deployed quickly. So that's one way that a service could be vulnerable. Another way is that it could be something that's been misconfigured. So maybe someone's installed something on the perimeter of the network. They haven't configured it according to the correct best practices. They might have made a configuration error in some way, or they might have had unneeded services enabled, which is just basically increasing the attack surface. So reviewing the configuration of your external services, making sure that things are being configured to best practices and that everything's sort of configured in a secure way is really important here. And then the last sort of category here is weak passwords or no MFA or weak MFA. So it could be that users are using weak passwords or they're using passwords that have been seen in password breaches before, which are sort of easy for attackers to get their hands onto. Multi-factor not enabled or enforced. We've responded to a lot of instances where MFA has just not been turned on. It might have been turned on, but it hasn't been enforced. So the users are it's kind of optional for them if they want to use it or not. We're responding to instances as well where attackers have managed to bypass MFA in some way. So we looked at the sort of credential harvesting page at the start where attackers can grab OTP codes. We've also seen attackers getting around push notifications, push-based MFA. So if an attacker just keeps on spamming you with sort of push notifications, eventually you might just press yes just to stop them from happening. So putting stronger MFA in place is really important. So things like FIDO2 tokens or the sort of code matching features that are available in some of the authenticator apps now are good things to do. In our example here, so this was an incident that happened back in 2022. So it's relating to this CV that came out in 2021. So the company in question here hadn't patched their Pulse Secure device for almost a year. It was sitting on the internet vulnerable. Our attacker over here is doing some kind of scanning activity. He identifies that this is a vulnerable VPN. It hasn't been patched. And it has a remote code execution vulnerability in which you can leverage. This vulnerability in particular was quite a good one because, well, it was a good one from an attacker perspective. It's a unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability, so you don't need any credentials on this VPN appliance at all. You can basically just execute code on it from the internet with no authentication required. So it's quite good for attackers. What that allows them to do is to inject some code into the VPN appliance that then gathers credentials and stores them in a plain text file, which they can then just export off the system. They've essentially got full control over the VPN. And they can also bypass MFA that was in place. So even if you've got MFA in place, because of this vulnerability, it's very easy to bypass that. So now, yeah, the attackers got stolen creds. They're able to bypass the MFA. And to make it worse, this particular organization had connected their VPN to Active Directory. So when the attacker was getting these lists of creds, they were all Active Directory domain creds that they were getting. And there was domain administrators who were logging in through this VPN. So the attacker basically just got domain admin creds in plain text and was able to get into the network as an administrator straight away. So how could we stop this one? So first of all, they weren't even aware that this vulnerability existed because they hadn't subscribed to these security alerts from the vendor. So making sure that you've added onto these email lists for any security alerts is really important. Making sure that network devices are included in regular patching schedules. So everyone's familiar with sort of the Microsoft Patch Tuesday and getting the patches rolled out sort of the week after that maybe. But network devices tend to be a little bit harder to patch. There's more users using them. People don't want to patch them in case something breaks and then the users can't connect into the network properly. But making sure they're in a regular patch schedule is really important. And then the final point here is around regular vulnerability scans. So if for some reason or other you've missed the security alert from the vendor, if you're doing regular vulnerability scans on sort of a weekly basis, those vulnerability scans will hopefully pick up any vulnerabilities that might have been missed and just alert you. So it's like a second layer of defense there. Right, so we've got our plain text creds sort of coming across here. So one recommendation here, which would make it a little bit more tricky for the attacker, would be to have separate credentials for VPN access. So when users are connecting into a VPN, they should use a different set of credentials to what they're using on the corporate network. It just means that the attacker would have access to the network, but not to AD at that point. So it makes it a little bit trickier for the attacker. And don't allow administrators to connect in using privileged accounts. So the way it should work is the administrator should connect in as a normal user into the network. Same as when they're logging onto their end user machine, shouldn't be logging onto end user machines with domain admin accounts. And then elevating access as and when they need to, ideally through some kind of PAM solution. And then the third sort of recommendation here is around unusual behavior. So in this particular incident, the VPN maintained a really good log of all of the connections coming into it. So we could see the source IP address. We could also see the client computer name that was connecting in. And it was really easy for us to find the attacker because the client computer name was in a really weird format. So having some kind of monitoring in place that's looking for those anomalies in connections into VPNs and similar bits of infrastructure is a good thing as well. A bit trickier to implement, though. All right, the last sort of example incident that we've got here is a compromised supplier. So there's two sort of categories of compromised supplier here. So we've got a compromised service provider on the left. So these would be examples of that recently would be things like the Capita incident, which has impacted quite a few companies who use Capita services. And then the other category we have is compromised software. So this would be things like the 3CX voice over IP compromise, where the Lazarus group got into 3CX somehow and modified that software to contain malicious code. So the example we're going to look at here is from a little while ago, the SolarWinds incident. This was quite an interesting one for us because of the the attacker used some really good techniques, and it was quite difficult for us to give recommendations to customers on how to prevent this kind of thing. So I think this is definitely falling into the sort of hard category in terms of being able to prevent. So what happened here is we have SolarWinds. SolarWinds makes some network monitoring software called Orion. So they're quite happily away, so beavering away, making their software. An attacker manages to gain access to the SolarWinds network and makes a malicious modification to this DLL that's loaded by the Orion product. So this is a legitimate DLL, which the attackers got into. They modified the source code for it, and they've basically got it compiled into this DLL file. So it's a legitimate DLL with malicious code inside of it. Like, if you looked at the DLL file, it's all signed by SolarWinds, so it looks like fully legitimate. Every time Orion opens up, it loads that DLL into memory. SolarWinds then goes off and they package this DLL file along with some other files into a legitimate software update, and they push that out to their customers. This is the customer over here, the victim. So they install the update because they're doing a really good job. They're keeping on top of all their patching. So they install this software update that's come out from SolarWinds onto their Orion server. And this server now has malicious code on it, and nobody knows about it. SolarWinds don't know about it. The victim doesn't know about it either. This is one of the sort of really clever elements of the attack. So it didn't do anything for a period of up to 2 weeks. It just sat there. Everything behaved normally. After a period of about 2 weeks, a DNS query is made out to a subdomain, to this avsvmcloud.com domain. So like a subdomain of that domain. Because each victim had a unique subdomain, the attacker was then able to identify these victims, and the queries basically end up on an attacker-controlled DNS server. The attacker then is able to, from some of the data in that subdomain, it's kind of encoded in there, the attacker is then able to determine if they want to deliver a second stage payload onto this victim or not. So in our example, they did deliver a second stage payload. So this is another sort of remote access Trojan that they delivered onto here. And then that connects out to a command and control server using HTTPS. So it's quite a tricky one to prevent because from the victim perspective, they're installing a legitimate software update. SolarWinds didn't know that they had malicious code in their product, and it all looks perfectly legitimate until these DNS queries started going out and weird network activity starts happening. So in terms of how to stop this one, there's a few recommendations that we came up with, sort of general recommendations for this. So the first one is around servers being able to communicate out to the internet. So we've got this SolarWinds Orion server. Does it need to communicate out to the internet? It probably does for some stuff, but what we should really have in place is we should have an allow list in place that contains just the IP addresses or domains that it needs to communicate out with to function. This example, it starts communicating out, it starts doing DNS queries to this weird domain. That's not part of its legitimate functionality. So if we blocked that and it was just allowed to communicate out to resources on the internet that it needed to, that would have stopped the incident at this stage. Running all services using restricted service accounts. So another slightly tricky one. So it's a piece of monitoring software. It needs to have connectivity to other machines on the network to be able to do its job, to see if those machines and services are up and running. But running it under a restricted service account as much as possible and not having the Orion product running as a domain admin would be a super good recommendation. And then implementing strict network segmentation internally. So once the attackers got onto this machine, they're going to want to move laterally on the network, get onto other systems. So putting all of these machines, implementing like micro-segmentation, making sure that servers can just communicate to servers that they need to on particular ports is quite a tricky thing to do, but it would really make it harder for the attacker to sort of move laterally if they had compromised that machine. All right, so we've covered the sort of first stages of the attack now. We're going to look at what typically happens after that. So in most of these incidents so far, the attacker's already got a command and control channel. So if they haven't, for example, in the VPN compromise, they're going to want to install some kind of tool on the network that's going to give them command and control capabilities. These are some common tools. There's a ton of them. There's a lot of open source tooling. There's a lot of commercial tooling in this space. Cobalt Strike is the one that keeps on coming up again and again. It's a legitimate pen testing tool, but attackers are using sort of cracked versions of it for malicious purposes. It's a really good tool. It's getting better in terms of detection on AV, so it's maybe a little bit harder for attackers to get away with now. But there's other tools like Brute Ratel and Nighthawk, which are sort of better at bypassing AV. So it's probably only a matter of time before attackers start moving over to those tools. I've got a couple of other examples of other sort of command and control frameworks that are quite commonly used. They're also going to want to escalate privileges. So they might have come into the network as a normal user. They're going to want to elevate to sort of local admin on the machine that they've landed on, and then ultimately try and get sort of domain admin privileges. So there's a few methods that they could use for doing this. So they could use a vulnerability in Windows that hasn't been patched, such as this one. This was a vulnerability in the COM+ subsystem in Windows that allowed a user to elevate access to system. So it was quite a nice vulnerability while it existed and hadn't been patched. Other techniques you can use is sort of looking around the place for passwords. So places that passwords tend to get stored quite commonly are, annoyingly enough, like files called password.txt or password.xlsx, but also in files, there's the groups.txt file that it tends to get used quite a lot in Active Directory, which might have cred stored in it as well. There could be PowerShell scripts lurking around the network, which have got credentials hard-coded in them. So the attacker will sort of poke around, and they'll try and find a method of getting sort of high levels of access on the network, ideally domain admin. If they've got local admin on a machine, they can then use tools like Mimikatz for elevating to domain admin. So if a domain administrator has logged onto that machine in the past, and the operating system has cached that user's credentials, if they run Mimikatz on it, they'll get the NTLM hash for that account, and then they can use a pass the hash attack, or they could take the hash offline and crack it and get the plain text password. If a domain admin has logged onto the machine recently, the plain text password might be in memory, and Mimikatz might be able to recover the plain text password from there. And then lateral movement is the next sort of thing that they're typically going to want to do. So we see a number of different tools being used for lateral movement. Some really common ones, a remote desktop. So a lot of organizations are still using RDP internally for administration purposes. So if an attacker can get an RDP session onto a machine, that's quite a good way for them to move, especially if it's being used legitimately, because it'll blend in with normal activity. And then we've got tools like PSExec as well. So PSExec is a signed Windows binary. You can download it from the Microsoft website. It doesn't get detected by antivirus. So they'll try and use these types of tools or use tools that are already available in the network where possible, rather than bringing in their own tools. They can also use functionality within some of these command and control frameworks as well. So Cobalt Strike, for example, has PSExec type functionality built into it. So they can use that for moving laterally as well. So how can we stop all of this stuff from happening? So, we've got our command and control frameworks up here. So one method the attackers use quite a lot for blending in a bit is to use DNS as a command and control channel. A lot of organizations don't have any monitoring or logging in place for DNS queries. But one quite useful thing to do is to block TXT record queries. So TXT record queries are the types of records that are used by command and control tools. They're not used very much legitimately. It's typically just mail servers that need to query TXT records. So there's a feature in Windows Server 2016 and above, which allows you to apply DNS policies to machines on the network. So you can say, right, this subnet, I don't want any TXT records from this subnet being queried. So it's quite an easy change to make. Block known Cobalt Strike team server IP addresses and any other sort of command and control tools that you can find IP addresses and domain names for. So a lot of threat intelligence feeds will have these in them. Whatever command and control servers are sort of visible on the internet will hopefully be in those feeds, and if you're able to get them into your security tooling to block those connections. Right, the next bit around sort of privilege escalation. So the first point, we're back to security patches. For Windows, it's fairly easy. I think most organizations are in a pretty good state with sort of getting patches pushed out to Windows machines. So that should be fairly easy. Control privileged accounts. So don't allow domain admins to log into end user machines. That's kind of stage one. Don't allow your services to run under privileged accounts. So don't have your Exchange server or your SQL Server database running as a domain admin. Another good one to help a bit around sort of Mimikatz is to use Credential Guard in Windows. So this has been around since Windows 10. It's a really good little feature. The only requirement is that you have Professional Enterprise Edition of Windows and a TPM chip in the machine. And what this does is it virtualizes the LSAS process on the machine. So it makes it more difficult for tools like Mimikatz to interface with that process and get those creds. And then finally, in terms of lateral movement, so we have RDP at the top of the list here. So how can we stop that sort of activity? So if we're using, depending on how much segmentation we've got on the network, we can also use host-based firewalls. So Windows comes with a firewall built into it. So we can apply some policies there to block any inbound connections into Windows machines. We shouldn't have any inbound connections coming into end user machines, for example. So we can configure the firewall on the end user machines to just block all inbound traffic. For servers, you probably only want your system administrators to be RDPing into them. So if you're using jump servers or some kind of PAM solution, you can just allow those IP addresses that are being used for the jump servers and PAM solutions to connect in. A bit trickier is monitoring for unusual traffic. So this is really, you really have to have good understanding of what normal looks like on your network, where the normal flows are between different network segments. So this is quite a hard one to implement. And then the app locker or Defender application control sort of application allow listing is really good for sort of preventing any unknown executables from running. But again, it's quite difficult for organizations to configure and sort of maintain that. So that is it from me. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments that people might have. I'm keen to hear what everyone else is up to in terms of recommendations from off the back of instance as well. So if anyone has any recommendations that weren't on there, I'd be really interested to hear about them. Yeah.
Yeah. So none of your recommendations sort of included like EDR stuff and active detection.
Yeah. Yeah, so when we're putting the recommendations together, we're trying to put recommendations together that the customers can implement without having to go and buy additional tooling. So most of these recommendations were based on features in Windows, basically. So using things that the organizations have already got. Most places have already got things like web filters and email filters. So it's more around recommendations around sort of configuring stuff correctly that they've already got. But yeah, absolutely, EDR software is really good in terms of stopping some of this stuff, but also allowing us to respond more effectively as well, because we can see exactly what's been happening on all the machines. So yeah, EDR is a really good recommendation as well, yeah.
Thanks, Andy. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring it to a close. Very interesting, very good.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.